And so with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers for this evening who are going to be talking about sort of the frameworks and their personal insights and experiences on solidarity and activism and cross-movement building. We have Nadine Sharafa here, who's with the Palestinian Youth Network. We have Shoaib Kamid, who's a member of Students for Justice in Palestine, Berkeley, and he's also a graduate student here at Berkeley. And we have Armel Melinas, who is with Anak Bayan East Bay and Bayan USA. So that's it.
I guess I'm starting. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And actually, if anyone has extra tissues, that would be really helpful. Really good. Small problem. I wanted to start off on the issue and the meaning of solidarity, kind of where Lubna left off. Because there's a lot of problematic areas when we talk about solidarity, something that's debated widely today and for some time. I see, and personally, and I feel others do as well as folks in the PYN, see solidarity in two different ways. Oh, you can hear me? Okay. So like I said, I see solidarity in two different ways. There's a sort of power solidarity and joint struggle. And I'm going to explain them a little bit both how I see it. When I talk in power dynamics is central to these different definitions I want to talk about when it comes to solidarity. The first one, kind of what I call power solidarity, is folks who have a lot of power in society. So in terms of class, race, gender, and sexuality. So for example, a heterosexual white male, upper class white male, is someone who has power in our society. And a lot of folks who fit those identities are in solidarity with the Palestinian people. And then I see something called joint struggle. Joint struggle are folks on race, class, gender, and sexuality who experience a lot of struggle depending on how they identify. And the term joint is key here. They struggle jointly with the Palestinian people because the Palestinian people suffer according to race, class, gender, and sexuality. The problem area is in this power solidarity, something I just termed 10 minutes ago. Power solidarity is folks who have a lot of power who tend to not have a justice-centered approach to solidarity. So in other words, they take up space from those who have experienced the most injustice. Does that make sense? So that could be very, very problematic because if your solidarity is justice-centered, you put those who've experienced the most injustice and fighting for justice at the center of your solidarity work. So Palestinians are not waiting for the white messiah, they're not waiting for the avatar you've seen the movie to infiltrate and save us all from our backwardness. That's not what we're looking for. And that's not solidarity, because if you don't have justice at the center, where those who experience the injustices are at the center of your solidarity work, that is not solidarity. You're just playing on your power dynamics, and that's not solidarity. That's not putting the voice of the voiceless at the center. And that's a problem. It's very, very problematic, and I see it playing out today here in the Bay Area. On the other hand, this term joint struggle, and I would like more folks to start speaking of solidarity in terms of joint struggle, especially folks in this room, is a lot of different communities. Here we have Anak Bayan and SJP, who are folks from communities of color who experience different types of injustices similar to that of Palestinians. And that's why we're in joint struggle with each other. I'd rather use the word joint struggle and solidarity because of all the negative words, implications that come with the word solidarity, that power solidarity that I was talking about. So that's how I view solidarity in those two different frameworks. And something that's extremely important, and I know it's not talked about as much when we have these conversations, is, I want to make the link in a second, is the economy of Palestine right now. Because if we stick to these power dynamics in terms of looking at the other, or even calling them the other or them, those Palestinians as weak, as backwards, not competent, we begin to use the charity framework to support the Palestinians. And the problem with Palestinians today is the dependency on aid, on foreign aid, whether from NGOs, from the IMF, from the World Bank, from other countries. So in Gaza alone, 80% of the GDP is dependent on foreign aid. So let me take you a few steps back, tell you a little bit about the economy process in a very, very short time period. Since the occupation in 1967, the economy, the Palestinian economy, was not really separate. So you're not going to find any statistics on Palestine between 67 and the Oslo Accords. It's all through the ICBS, Israeli Center for Bureau of Statistics. Was what is called a one-sided customs union. Customs union, for example, like the European Union is a customs union where they try to work collectively for a more efficient economy, have similar tariffs for other commodities from different countries coming into those countries. Now in Palestine, I know this is a little bit complicated, but we need to talk about it. Towards the Palestinians, it's called a one-sided, instead of just a general customs union, a one-sided customs union, because Israel controlled everything that came into the Palestinians. So much so that 90% of imports for the Palestinians were coming from Israel, between 67 and 87, and into the 90s. So imagine 90% of imports is coming from Israel. So during that time period, the Palestinians were dependent on Israel for its economy to thrive. It wasn't really thriving. Come the 90s, and I'm just going through this history so that we can have a little bit of a context. Come the 90s, the Oslo Accords, which really pushed the Palestinians even further back towards their liberation. The one-sided customs union continued, but we see a new dynamic coming up, and that's the NGOization of the occupied territories of Palestine. And a new class forming with the NGOs that came about. So we're still dependent, Palestinians, on Israeli imports. In fact, most of the imports coming in, especially in Gaza, is coming from Israel. The rest of it is money coming from foreign aid. And the new class that developed when the Oslo Accords were signed was the Palestinian Authority class, and the class that thrived on this foreign aid. So we got this new NGO, nonprofit class making money off of the money coming in through NGOs and through foreign governments and through the IMF and the World Bank. Okay. The problem with that is the way the aid was coming in was not to support the infrastructure and the institutions that since 48 up to the 90s were not allowed to be built by Palestinians. Business licenses, Palestinians weren't allowed to have business licenses. Again, no control over our economy whatsoever since imports were coming only from Israel, 90% of it. What they were funding, most of these NGOs, was state building and democracy, quote unquote. So the money that the Palestinians thought were coming in to supposedly build a sovereign state sometime in the future wasn't coming for infrastructure institutions, because what the IMF, the World Bank, and the NGOs found is that we're in an emergency situation here, the poverty line is so high, we need to just do emergency relief and fund things under the context of state building. So again, instead of focusing on infrastructures, what they were focusing on is building a strong power structure around Yasser Arafat, a very strong Palestinian Authority. And a lot of money was going into the salaries of a lot of the folks in the PA. So a lot of the corruption, so instead of transparency, focusing on transparency and building institutions and infrastructure, we're focusing on building the strong power structure with no transparency and the rising corruption and a lot of funds going to folks in the PA specifically, and this is well documented, you can come to me afterwards and I can tell you where to read it, specifically for Fatah. So NGOs were responsible, one, for the dependency of the Palestinian economy on others, not themselves. Two, for funding the occupation. Because instead of looking at the human rights abuses that were occurring on the ground, several of the Israeli policies occurring on the ground that's stopping a lot of this infrastructure, institution building, we're focusing on this state building, quote-unquote democracy, and sending money to this Palestinian Authority. So NGOs are implicit in the funding of the occupation. The settlements that continue to be built, just today 130 were approved, new settlements were approved in East Jerusalem, this is just today. The checkpoints that continue. So instead of these NGOs and these foreign governments looking at a lot of these challenges that are stopping the Palestinians from living freely, from being self-sufficient and sustainable, they're ignoring these things, the settlements, the checkpoints, For example, the education level, Palestinians had a high very education level. Now this is decreasing. I know the SJP did some events recently highlighting how the checkpoints are preventing several students from going to school. 64% of students from Najaf University talked about experiencing harassment at the checkpoints. And more than 90% missed classes as a result of harassment at the checkpoints. The wall is another thing, the siege in Gaza is another thing, not allowing building for the infrastructure. You might have heard there's a mall being built in Gaza. We have a beautiful mall being built in Gaza. Another thing, the problem with the NGOs, is putting money, again, remember state building, democracy, also for special infrastructure, non-productive infrastructure, like hotels, restaurants, something that will not sustain the economy of the Palestinian people. This is money that, because the World Bank and IMF are giving it to the Palestinians, they're like, you have to do this and this and this with it. Interestingly enough, I was just reading today that Gaza actually experienced a growth in its economy, very, very little, about 16%. And the West Bank, which, as you know, the US is putting a lot of money training the Palestinian Authority security services against its own people, giving a lot of money to Salam Fayyad, the prime minister, who said we're going to have a flourishing private sector, flourishing economy in the West Bank. Interestingly, in the West Bank, the economy only grew about 9%. And the only reason that the Gaza economy grew about 16% is because of the tunnels. That's how we're funding our economy, is ourselves building, digging holes to Egypt, grabbing some commodities, and bringing it back and selling it. That's where the number 16% comes from. So the first one is the state building. The second problem is funding the occupation. And the third problem, why I mentioned these statistics in the West Bank and Gaza, is funding the split between the West Bank and Gaza, between the different parties. They're funding it because one, funding is going mostly for Fatah. Funding is going to build these special infrastructure projects, mostly in the West Bank and a few in Gaza. So we need to be very, very careful when we talk about solidarity, when we talk about quote-unquote charity, we talk about supporting the Palestinians financially in this way. Be very careful how we speak about that, because the current trend that is going on right now is not only are we dependent on Israel because it controls all entry and exit points and airspace, but also we're dependent on foreign aid and divestment from NGOs. So that's number one. And I'm wanting to switch it really fast to those who try to resist these things that are going on. And by the way, these things that I talked about, the NGOs, the nonprofits, one of the biggest problems to them is it diverts attention away from the goal of liberation to building a state that you can't really build, to putting money towards anything working towards a peace process, a normalization action. Let's sit down and have coffee and talk about how you destroy my home. So that's another problem with nonprofits, and that dynamic is not just specific to Palestine. That dynamic, I see it here in the Bay Area with nonprofits who, in my personal opinion, I feel have taken away, and I think I spoke about this before with some folks from Bayan in the Filipino community, taking away this struggle for liberation and institutionalizing it in these nonprofits who now have to appeal to their funders and donors of how to spend that money, which is usually not sustainable. I now got laid off from a nonprofit because it's not sustainable. So those who are resisting these types of action, this second occupation, supposedly you can term it that, what we're seeing is a rise in the attempt to silence a lot of these folks who are resisting, a lot of folks in this room, globally and in Palestine. And I'm just going to give a few examples. And we're seeing it more and more and more at the rate, as you remember, Qoitel Pro in the 60s and 70s, we're seeing something similar with the Patriot Act, the Material Support Clause that we can talk about later in Q&A, using those directives, which by the way started in the Clinton era, to silence resisting communities here in the United States and abroad.